Hello, and welcome to Creating an Advisory Program That Works with Kate Tobias and Matt Pearsall. Again, another outstanding topic for us to help you reach every student, grow professionally, and create great schools. Thanks to Kate and Matt and the Committee for Children for helping us add this wonderful information to AMLE's growing suite of webinars. Today's webinar is brought to you by AMLE and the support of AMLE members like you. I am Will Weidlich, Executive Director of AMLE. And today we have with us Kate Tobias and Matt Pearsall. Kate is a Territorial Manager for Committee for Children, where she helps bring the benefits of social emotional learning, bullying prevention, and child sexual abuse prevention programs to schools and their students. Matt is a Senior Educational Designer for the Committee for Children, where he designs research-based second step social emotional learning curricula. So thank you for being here this afternoon to share your knowledge and resources for our middle level educators and leaders out there. And of course, this webinar wouldn't be possible without everyone who's joining us today in the audience. So on behalf of everyone at AMLE, I want to thank you for being here today. Be sure to use the question box to introduce yourself, say where you're from, submit questions, etc. I'll be monitoring that question box and sharing questions with our presenters. Also, appreciation to anyone who's checking out this webinar in the archive form. Thank you for your interest in the topic and in AMLE as a professional learning source. We always like to remind everyone that we are here at AMLE, and check out our website often and spread the word to other folks as well. We keep raising our hands and praise for middle level education, and you can find everything you need anytime that you like at www.amle.org. So check it out and get the resources that you need. Before we get started on today's exceptional webinar, I just wanted to remind everyone that AMLE has more great webinars coming up. Check back at amle.org/webinars for our upcoming schedule. Whether you're trying to earn professional learning credits, certification, or recertification, or just want to learn great stuff to help students you serve, these free webinars are here for you. So after today's webinar, reflect on your learning and then register for more. So without further ado, here to help us with creating advisory programs that work is Kate Tobias and Matt Pearsall. Kate and Matt, let's turn it over to you.
All right, everybody, thank you so much. I am going to start our PowerPoint here. My name is Kate, obviously, you heard that. I'm here to represent Committee for Children, which is the nonprofit organization and creator of the Second Step Social Emotional Learning Program for middle school. So I'm going to introduce myself, and here's our photos. And I'm going to pass this off to Matt, who's going to be the presenter of the webinar in just a second. But I'm also going to jump back in at the end of the webinar to give you a brief snapshot of our middle school curriculum from Second Step. So without further ado, Matt, why don't you tell us more about yourself as we get this started?
Sure. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Matt Pearsall. I'm a Senior Educational Designer here at Committee for Children, working on the design of our social emotional learning programs and bullying prevention programs and child abuse prevention programs. Right now, I'm working on our new high school SEL program that is coming into existence as we speak. But before that, I spent several years working on a new middle school program that was just released. And as part of that project, I led the development of the advisory materials that are integrated into that program. So it's my work on those advisory materials that's kind of led me to here today. I got a real wonderful opportunity to spend a lot of time reading research on advisory and observing advisories that kind of built on my own experience as an advisory teacher. Before I was this, I was a high school teacher. And I had an advisory program. My own experience as an advisory teacher was absolutely terrible, which is kind of what inspired me to do this work. And it's also been great to be able to see what advisories can look like when they're not like the advisory that I was part of. It's real. We're going to talk about that real stuff as we kind of go through here. Before I was at Second Step, I was a high school social studies and language arts teacher at a kind of a high needs high school outside of Seattle, Washington. Got to work with a wonderful, diverse group of students and teachers at that location. Before that, I was an actor, and as part of my acting, I did a lot of middle school educational theater where I dressed up in chainmail and swung a sword around. If any of you all are attending from the greater Chicago area and you've ever hired a place called Caton Enterprises to come out and do sword fighting shows for your sixth graders, that's what I did. And I also want to introduce somebody else who couldn't be here today. There's a woman named Doris Johnson, who is the principal of Meridian Middle School in Kent, Washington, outside of Seattle. And we had the opportunity to work closely with her and her staff and her students in the development of the Second Step middle school program and the advisory materials, and got to watch her establish an advisory program as we were working on our work. And unfortunately, she can't be here today, but I'm going to do my best to kind of share her experiences in establishing an advisory program, so that you can hear about research and theory from me, and you can sort of hear about reality from Doris through me. So with that, I'm going to get started with the presentation. So we're going to be doing practical strategies for designing a custom advisory program. Essentially, it's easy to talk about advisory at a really high level, but in order to be successful, we got to think about it from a realistic point of view, and hopefully this is going to get you either started on that or help you restarting an advisory program. And I'm going to start off by kind of thinking about what we all bring to the table. We all have experiences with advisory. We're either doing them, or we've done them, or we've heard about them, or in reading about them and preparing for them, we have our own thoughts about them. So before I deluge you with all of my thoughts about advisory, I'd love to hear kind of some of the words that come to your mind as you think about your own plans for advisory. Just take a moment to enter them in the question box, and I'll be looking at them and seeing what everyone comes up with. Connection, team, support, relationships and safety, support, rich and meaningful experience. And there's a lot of good stuff that you guys are coming up with here. Helpful building relationships, advocacy. That comes right out of the research for advisory. Somebody's been reading their research. Relationships, fun. I appreciate seeing fun in there. Family is a nice one. There's a lot of nice stuff that y'all are coming up with. I want to show you something. Oh, a place for all kids. It's awesome. I mean, and that's something that often we can struggle to create. School can be a place for some kids or a lot of kids, but where do we find a place for the kids who don't find their place easily in middle school? And a lot of times that can be an advisory program. So I want to show kind of along the same lines of all the words you've been putting into. This is something I did. I took all of the research articles that I read, and a lot of non-research articles as well, and I dumped them all into Wordle, and this is what came out for when you're reading about advisory, the words that stand out. And I appreciate this because of what's clearly at the front of teachers and students. And we're going to talk about a lot of different ways that advisories can be a lot of different things, but at their core, really, that's what makes advisory special, is the teachers and the students, and the fact that they have this chance to build relationships with each other. Advisories can be a lot of different things, but at the end, they're really all about relationships. And as you look at this thing, you see a lot of the same words that y'all were saying there as well: community, support, caring, things like that. So. So, what are the things that you find compelling about advisories? What has been your previous experience? What part of the experience led you to this session? Again, take a moment, kind of add this stuff into the chat box. I'd love to see what you're saying, and I will read it off. The questions box, excuse me, the questions box. Need more structure? Yeah, that's a big stumbling block we're going to talk about here. Advisories they live and die by the structures in place to support them. Teachers don't buy in. We're going to talk all about that. Can you do advisory with only 15 minutes a day? Absolutely, you can do advisory with only 15 minutes a day. How can it help their self-confidence? It can help it a lot. I like this one. I think this is the one I'm gonna end on. Is how to make it work. Because it's a big question with advisory. Advisories are places to build, what I'm saying, places to build student-teacher relationships, practice social skills in a safe environment, and build social connections to academic experiences. And a quote I like from one of the research articles that I read. You're going to see the citations for this at the end of the session. Is advisory offers the structure to meet students' developmental needs because it is the one place in the school where students are intimately known as a whole child. Research shows that these things can boost both the short and the long-term social and academic success of students. And I think it's this power of advisory is one of the reasons why AMLE actually puts advisories as a core part of the middle school model. If you read This We Believe, advisories are right in there as something that a middle school should have. Research also shows very clearly that advisories are very difficult to implement and often fail. Anyone who's had experience with an advisory, this won't come to you as a surprise. You know they're difficult. If you haven't experienced real problems with advisory, that's great, but I bet you've talked to somebody who has. So being cognizant of that is really important. And we're all here because despite these challenges, we all recognize the value of advisory and we want to bring that value to our students. So here's our objectives, and we're going to be talking about today. We're going to start off by looking at some of these roadblocks to developing a successful advisory program, all this dark and twisty stuff I've been kind of alluding to here around why they're difficult. And then after that, we're going to talk about some of the ways that you can build a successful advisory program. Identifying common building blocks is how I'm going to talk about it. And this kind of gets to that structure that was mentioned earlier. And then I've got on here, create a plan for developing a custom advisory program. That's not going to happen by the end of this session. But hopefully you'll see the path towards creating that plan. We're going to be providing some resources to help you with that. In fact, you can download them right now. They should be visible to you through the handout section of the interface. I don't know what program we're on at the moment, but this program here. Go to webinar. Thank you. And through that, you'll be able to start your thinking about it. You'll have the tools to take back to the people you're working with so that you can start thinking together about how to get there. If you've already got an advisory program, I think this will be really useful to you as a way to think about what your next step can be. All right, so I want to start with another poll. So who are you? There's a lot of different roles that people can be having, and I'm curious, who are the people here attending? Who are you? A lot of teachers, that's great. Nice mix of counselors, administrators. I appreciate the advisory coordinators that are checking in. It's a hard job. Being an advisory coordinator is not easy. I've not done it myself, but I've assisted and I've seen it done. And thank you for volunteering or being voluntold, whatever it was, but I really appreciate that you're doing it. All right, so we got a really nice mix of people. I really appreciate seeing you all joining us. And I think this is going to be relevant to this, even though there's a nice mix, I think this is going to be really relevant to everybody. So we move on and get into some of this stuff around why advisories aren't easy. So research says that there are basically three big traits that successful advisory programs all share. They have student buy-in. Students see the advisory experience as being meaningful to them. They have staff buy-in. Staff see it as a meaningful learning experience for students. Staff also feel supported. So it's not just that they buy into the theory of advisory, but they buy into how it's being implemented as well. And that advisory programs recognize the constraints that they work under. An advisory program is designed to fit within the budget that's set for it, the time in the schedule for it, and the time that is available to prepare for it. When advisory programs are built within those constraints and are realistic within those constraints, that leads to a lot more staff buy-in and student buy-in. And then beyond those three kind of markers of success, one thing that's really common about advisory programs is that they aren't built in a day. They take time to develop. There's a lot of essentially kind of building a culture of advisory in a school, and it can take time. That culture needs to be built for students. They're not going to buy in on day one. I've seen a lot of times that it can take a couple of years to build a really strong advisory culture at a school among students. If you're at a 6-8 middle school and you start an advisory program, your 7th and 8th graders remember when there wasn't an advisory program. Or if you're revitalizing an advisory program, they remember when advisory wasn't something that was they saw as meaningful. And it'll take time to kind of get them on board. And sometimes it can just be a matter of working and refining your process until those 6th graders or 8th graders and everyone in your school just sees advisory as something that is part of the fabric of your school and not something new and weird. Similarly, it takes time to build that culture among teachers. Advisory has been shown to have great effects for students around attendance and supporting kind of their academic and social connections to school. But those take time to appear. Students aren't going to instantly transform over a course of a few weeks or months, and so it's going to take time for teachers to see the results of their work. But as they do, they will buy in more and more. So I want to share kind of the first of the anecdotes from the field. I'm calling something that Doris experienced as she was launching her middle school program in Meridian a couple of years ago. Was that to think about how would the second step program fit into everything else they were doing. So this is kind of around their time in the schedule. They were already doing things like AVID, and they had a PBIS, positive discipline program that they were implementing. They had lots of other initiatives that were both school driven and district driven. How did their advisory program fit into that? And in their case, they chose to use the second step program. They wanted to have a specific thing that was not being addressed through their other programs, and that was social emotional learning. They looked at the second step program. That's what brought them to us. But the answer for yours, forgive me for saying this, Kate, the answer for you may not be the second step program. There's a lot of different ways to go. And while I'm going to talk about the second step program a lot, keep that in mind. We're not the sum total of advisories, and what you're going to do could look very different. And they also decided they really need to be intentional about the groups they're creating. That's kind of their time in their schedule again, and how to get that student buy-in was trying to really think thoughtfully about the culture they're going to have in each individual advisory class. And they did a lot of listening to teachers. There was a lot of concern from teachers. They had actually had advisory in the past, and it hadn't worked. It hadn't worked to the point where, I don't know the story behind this, but their union had made a specific bargaining point that there would be no advisory. And so that was in their contract for a while. And that had recently been removed from their contract, but the effects of whatever had led to that still existed. So she needed to really listen to the teachers, take their concerns into consideration, which I think is actually really important. Teachers that have had poor experience with advisory are great people to learn from about what you're going to do. But then ultimately stand firm behind the need for advisory and saying that this is something that needs to be done. So how do you get to that point? How do you get to having a successful advisory program? The keys to establishing it, again, according to research, are to have clear goals up front for your program, and then to customize your program to meet your building's particular needs. When you do this, you are acknowledging your constraints, and you're going to get student-to-teacher buy-in. It's really simple. This is all you got to do. It's simple for me to write. It's simple for me to type up on a screen. It is not exactly simple to do. We can start thinking about the goals. So the goals is a great place to start. If you've take one of those downloads and you've opened up one of the downloads is like a worksheet to work through on thinking about your advisory program. And you'll see this information on that worksheet. Researchers looking at advisory have identified 6 core things that happen in that schools often do in advisory programs. And I'm going to read to you from the research here. Advocacy, community skills, invigoration, academics, and administrative stuff are the 6 types of things that often happen in an advisory program. Of the 6 types, 4 involve effective needs and include advocacy, community skills, and invigoration. 2 program types, skills and academics, also address cognitive needs. And then the administrative one sitting out there is housekeeping. It's issues such as attendance, general school business, daily announcements, and the like. I'm kind of going through these to dig into these a little bit more. Advocacy, that's why I really appreciated it. Somebody mentioned this at the very beginning. When I was a teacher, this was the part I really loved about advisory the most. It's putting the teacher, the advisor in this case, is specifically tasked with being their students' allies at the school. They help students navigate academic, social, and behavioral issues they encounter by always representing that student being on their side. if a student is struggling in math class, their advisor can note that and say, hey, what are you doing for your math class? Can support them in stuff they can do. But also that advisor, one part of that advisor's job as an advocate is to go to the math teacher and say, this is what my student needs. How can my student get this? And to facilitate that conversation between a teacher and a student. Similarly, along behavioral issues, students could be struggling with various behavior issues, getting in trouble in school, and that advisor's job is to be on the student side, to hear the student, side of it, and to speak for the student on behalf of in matters of discipline. Often students don't feel like they have an advocate among adults at schools, or it can be unclear to them that they are being advocated for. It's not something that they see happening. And putting this at the center of advisory can be really powerful. It can really help students connect and build a strong relationship with their advisor. The next one is community building, and this is around kind of setting norms in a school. Creating a safe and supportive school environment is how we call it in second step. And a lot of this norm setting, you can think of about, it goes hand in hand with bullying prevention and harassment prevention, and also just kind of helping kids get along with each other by talking about that sort of thing and surfacing it and giving kids a chance to really think about it in a formal way. You're helping to set norms. You're giving a space for students to set to take an active role in setting the norms of behavior between each other. Skill building. This is as close to school as you get in an advisory program. Direct instruction on any skills that are not being covered in academic classes that you want to cover. If you choose second step, you'd be focusing on social emotional skills. Other things could be study skills, or there's all sorts of different things. Digital literacy, various different things that you might want to cover. The next one is invigoration, motivation. This kind of goes along with community building in a way. It's things that you do to increase students' connection to school, to get them to want to come to school. Fun. Somebody mentioned fun earlier. Doing fun activities is part of making an advisory about invigoration. One of the things that advisories have been shown to be really effective at is boosting attendance and supporting students who might otherwise, be not attending enough to do well, be on a road to dropping out. By creating these fun activities, this space where students come where they really want to be there, when maybe they're really alienated from their academic experience. That for students on deciding whether to come to school that day or not, that can be the tipping point to get them to come to school. The next one is academic support, time devoted to supporting students' work in academic classes. This can be as simple as study hall. That can be a really useful thing if students are using it effectively. A chance to get caught up, especially for students that have difficulty doing homework outside of school because of chaotic outside of school environments, or various lack of access to technology, various different things. They get a chance to sort of kind of catch up with the people who do have the ability to do that outside of school. It can also be a chance for sort of like office hours for teachers. Oftentimes teachers are so busy in the day that they can't actually stop and answer questions for students because they're getting ready for another class. The passing period, they're getting things changed. There's meetings after school. There's meetings before school. So having an advisory be a chance for students to go and meet with whatever teacher they need to meet with can be really useful for both the students and the teachers. And finally, there's the administrative stuff, the least sexy stuff that you can do in an advisory class. Doing permission slips and district mandated messages and attendance and announcements. This is often something that's not on people's radar when they're planning their advisory. But this is often things that get done in advisory because this is the easy place to do it. So as you're planning for advisory, you want to be really realistic about how much administrative stuff is going to be done in there and how is that going to affect the time you have to do the other things you want to do. In the end, there's a mix of these. You don't just do one usually. Usually an advisory has a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and you're going to make your own. You're going to decide how much of this and how much of that you're going to want. And you kind of think about that and how are you going to decide what you're going to do. You kind of turn again to Meridian Middle School and Doris's experience. And she sat down and worked with her leadership team to decide what they want to do with advisory. And they first wanted to align it with the school and district mission and vision. And then they wanted to look at their data. And they saw that in their data, their academics weren't exactly where they wanted them to be. They had they had significant issues with discipline and suspensions in particular. And then they had done school climate work in the previous year and shown that students were not feeling as safe and comfortable in school as they would like. And so they decided to do a mix of social emotional learning, which we talked about with Second Step, and also to try to do more fun activities to kind of get students to be more comfortable in school. So I want to do another poll just for a second. And now that you've kind of been introduced to this concept of these 6 different goals, which goals do you see yourself wanting to choose? And you can choose as many on here as you want. Which ones appeal to you? Which ones are you already thinking about? Community and invigoration are kind of lumped together here because we only have so many slots in the poll. So I'm seeing a focus on community and invigoration and advocacy, and which I really like to see. I'm not seeing a lot of administrative there at the bottom. Just be realistic about that. I'm not saying you're wrong, but if you feel like somebody else might come along and see your advisory program that you're carefully cultivating as a chance to do district mandated something, then be aware of that and think about it. But I really like seeing that emphasis on community and invigoration. I really like seeing the emphasis on advocacy because it's a really powerful thing. And advocacy also doesn't take a lot of planning. It's mostly about teachers listening and supporting. So, and we'll show you an example of what advocacy looks like in a little bit. I think that's great. I like seeing what you all are working on. So, how do you plan this? How do you put your advisory program together? Schools rarely have the luxury of devoting a significant amount of staff time or resources to thoroughly developing a homegrown advisory program. So, it can be tempting to just take something from somewhere else, copy something, you can get online and you can see the entire advisory program for a school on the other side of the country from you that they posted online. You could just take that and do it. You could buy a book that says, here's a bunch of advisory activities. You could start at the beginning of the book and work your way to the end of the book. You could get the Second Step program and you could do the exact same thing. I would caution you to resist this temptation. And think back to what you need to get. You need to get student buy-in, staff buy-in, and constraints. And the way that you're going to do that is by customizing it. A program, how to get student buy-in, staff buy-in, and what your constraints are going to be different from district to district. They're going to be different from building to building, and they can even be different from class to class within a building. And so if you can find something that off the shelf that meets all of those needs specifically for you, then that's great and you're really lucky. The reality is that you're going to have to do that you're going to have to do work around it yourself. And I think starting that is to talk about constraints. To start about that customization, how are you going to make this your own, is to think about your constraints. What are your total class time? What's the time? I like this picture. We actually debated whether to put this picture in here or not because it's showing this person doing this Herculean impossible thing. I'm taking this massive boulder to the top of a mountain. And I think a lot of people are like, I'm going to do that. I'm going to haul this up. I'm going to make this awesome advisory program. And it's going to be great and wonderful. I think the reason I like this picture is because the very next moment after this is taken, this man is squashed underneath the rock. The rock rolls back down to the hill, and there's just little bits of person left. And we really want to avoid that. Don't be this person. Don't lift the giant rock because you can't. And don't expect other people to lift this giant rock for you because they won't. What you need to do is you need to be realistic, essentially. What is the total class time that you have? How many minutes a week are you setting aside for advisory, and how is that time chunked out? Somebody asked, can you do advisory in 15 minutes? And I said, yes, if you're really realistic about what you're going to get done in that advisory. What activities lend themselves to those chunks? You've got 15 minutes. Don't try to do a service learning project. On the flip side of that, if you've got 2 hours a week, two 1-hour blocks a week set aside, this is my experience as an advisory teacher, if you've got 2 1-hour blocks set aside, don't just think your teachers can just fill that with whatever. That time needs structure, and you need to have stuff in place in order to support teachers in that time. Or else students are going to get a really uneven experience, and you're not going to get that student or that teacher buy-in. When you're thinking about total class time, also think about what's available to use. That's what I was talking about. Administrative stuff, How much is that going to be eaten up? What are some district-mandated things that might come down? Also, how often do you anticipate your advisory being canceled due to holiday scheduling, testing, assemblies, or field trips? If you want to do a big like project-oriented advisory program where you're doing service learning and getting out in the community, and you set aside an hour a week to do that, but then you cancel it 3 weeks out of the month because of other things, then you only got 1 hour a month, and that's a very different story. So think about the priority that your school is going to place on your advisory program and how often that time is going to get repurposed. And then think about the prep time. Who's going to prep for your advisory? How much time will they have to prep? You know, and finally, what's your budget? And I think these two things are kind of tied together. One of the things that comes over and over again in the research I've read is that one of the things that causes an advisory to fail is that teachers are asked to plan the advisories and they're not given time to plan it, and they're not, frankly, they're not paid to plan it. It's an extra prep that is what it becomes, and that's a very difficult path to go. Teachers need a lot of support to be able to do that, and at the beginning of the school year, when you're really excited about advisory, it can be really easy to get people to plan and do things, and your advisory coordinator will be super bought in and be pushing stuff out to the whole school. But come November, December, January, when you're in the middle of the school year, the motivation is going to drop. And so think about how you're going to maintain that motivation. Sometimes it's about paying somebody the time to be able to do the planning that you need to have done. And then programs that are well aligned to constraints stand a better chance of getting student and staff buy-in and having positive effects. And finally, just be ready to adjust because things are going to change. The way this looked for Meridian was that they thought about their master schedule and planned it out. They did surveys with students and teachers in order to kind of plan what they wanted to do in their advisory. Doris worked really closely with their teachers around the pros and the cons, and acknowledged their fears, but she really wanted to be solution oriented. So when teachers said they were worried about various things about advisory implementation, she said, that's great, now how are we going to solve that? And then we had talked about their contract situation already, but it was a big concern for her was working with the union. And then time, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit when we get into schedules. So this is what someone was getting at before. Customization doesn't have to be labor intensive, although it can be. If you really want it to be labor intensive, go for it. But it doesn't have to be this way. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You just make the wheel your own. And by this is where I want to get into building blocks. And a minute ago, I said, don't take a program from the other part of the country. Don't take out an advisory book. Don't take Second Step and just plunk it right into your program. But what you can do is you can take that program from across the country or that book or Second Step, and you can use the building blocks that are there, and you can rearrange them however you need to make it work for you. And that's how Second Step is set up. It's not set up to be a thing that you just plunk in and do from beginning to end. It's set up in a very modular way, so that you can sort of think of this like you're building your Lego advisory castle. And in Second Step, we break these activities down into these different categories. There's lessons, and these are exactly what you think. They're things that explicitly teach key content. In Second Step, that would be social emotional learning content. Other things exist that there's character ed programs, there's digital literacy programs, there's all sorts of different programs that you could fit in that's AVID and their study habits programs, things like that. One thing that I think is worth mentioning, something that I found really interesting when looking at research and really reframed how I looked at a lot of advisory programs, is that it shows that the more like a regular class advisories look like, the harder it is to get student buy-in. If students feel like going to advisory is in the same category as going to math class or going to language arts class, they're going to see it that way, and it's harder to get them to build those relationships with staff. But when it feels like they're stepping out of the regular academic world and into an advisory space that's different and more supportive and more relationship-based, then they're more likely to do the work that they need to do to build those relationships. So when you're teaching lessons, think about how do you teach those lessons in a way that is not so lessoning. When we were designing the lessons that are in second step, we designed them to be very student-oriented, student-focused, discussion-driven, with students supplying, essentially students are the experts on their lives, and we provide a space for them to talk about them. And the idea that that's a different experience than they have in other classes, and it's going to help them engage. The next kind of basic building block are challenges. And I like to think they're all the fun things that you can do. They're team building games and relationship games and trust games and all sorts of games and lots of different ways that you can do it. They're just fun. They get kids up and moving around and make for a nice change of pace in the day, along with doing lots of good educational things. Discussions. They're a chance for students to talk with each other and staff about themselves and their own experience. Discussions are a great way to build community. They're a great way to build relationships. I think a program that does amazing things with discussions is restorative practices of restorative justice. And it's all focused on discussions. And a part of restorative practices is community building circles, where everyone sits in a circle and for a few minutes every day, they talk about something that's kind of personal. And the discussions that you'll find in the second step program, second step advisory program, are modeled very much on restorative practices and the work and the research behind restorative practices. In fact, if you are doing a restorative practice implementation at your school, second step would work really well with it as those community building circles. And then there's academic supports are another one. This is talking about the advocacy and having students as the advisor's ally. We have an example. If you download the other handout from this webinar, the advisory guide, you'll see examples of all of these building blocks in there. And the example we have in there of an academic support is these academic check-ins and check-outs, where these essentially short rituals that get done at the beginning of a week and the end of the week, where the advisor checks in with students, makes sure that they're ready for the week, makes sure that they're that they're aware of what they need to do and have the materials they need to be successful. And then at the end of the week, they check out and sort of briefly debrief about the week and get themselves thinking ahead to what they need to do over the weekend to be ready for the next week. And the final building block is projects. In second step, we really focus on service learning. You can do project-based learning in a lot of different ways, but service learning is something that there's a lot of literature that shows it's a powerful experience for students, and it's also a difficult one to fit into school days. And making an advisory about projects can be a really powerful experience for students and for staff. So I want you to take a moment, and I want to when you think about these building blocks, thinking about what kind of schedule you anticipate, just take a moment to visualize what your week would look like. What would your week or month of advisory look like? What kind of stuff would you want to do? These are some examples that we provide with second step program that are kind of a way to break up an advisory program. One of them shows, where you've got a little bit of time every day, you got a little bit more time on one day in order to teach a lesson, but everything else is much shorter. And if you don't have time for a lesson, you can still do really powerful things with advisories that don't have that like 25-minute lesson chunk. That just have 10 or 15 minutes a day. You're just doing discussions and challenges and other things like that. And then you see the other example of where you're putting a service learning project in there. So, and there's a lot of different ways you can do this. There are as many ways to build an advisory schedule as there are advisories out there. And how you do it can change from year to year too. This is a place where I think that you'll learn a lot from your first year. And Doris learned a lot in her first year. So when they first did their first year of advisory, they decided that what they called advisory was called roar time. And roar time was attached to second period. So you went to second period class, and after second period ended, you stayed in second period and you did your roar time. And they did this intentionally because they didn't want to add an extra passing period. An extra passing period would have been 5 extra minutes where students aren't learning in the day. It's another chance for students to go out in the hallways and run around and have all of the things happen during passing period that can happen during passing period. So they said, we'll just have it be attached. But they found that they had real difficulty with students kind of seeing advisory as something different than second period. Teachers also had that trouble. A teacher who was running late on their lesson in second period would just keep teaching the lesson into roar time. Students that had a difficult relationship with their teacher because they had difficulty with the academics in second period continued to have difficulty with that teacher during roar time. So they adjusted, and in year 2 they decided to In year 2, they decided to break out more time into a separate period, essentially, with a passing period that got into it. This did lead to them having an extra passing period. This did lead to all the stuff that led to. But on the other hand, it allowed them to be more intentional about what they did with advisory. They could be more intentional about which students went with which teachers. It also gave them the opportunity to, because nobody had a prep, every teacher was available to teach an advisory. And they were able to have smaller advisories. And I think that that's a real key thing. One of the things that comes out of research as well is that an ideal size for an advisory is 10, 12, 15 students. And that can be hard to do. So one of the ways you can do that is by having advisory be its own period so that you can have every teacher on board. In Washington State, you're required to have a certificated teacher present at all times with students. But I've talked with people in other states where that isn't the case, and they've done really cool things where they have paras taking on their own advisories. They have support staff taking in advisories, custodians and office staff taking on advisories. And it's a really powerful experience because students often develop connections with adults who aren't teachers. And those people and those support staff really enjoyed the chance to be able to have this relationship building experience with students. And that allows those schools to get those advisory sizes down really small when you have every adult in the building essentially taking on an advisory class, you can spread out the students a lot farther. So the last thing I want to touch on, and we're getting close to questions, I know a lot of people have questions. The last thing I want to touch on is this idea of autonomy. So what I was saying is within a building, the needs of advisory can vary. Buildings vary in what they need for advisory. That's why you as an advisory coordinator or an administrator need to think about how to customize your program. But within a building, the needs can vary from class to class. And that's where, to the extent it's possible to do, you as an administrator and advisory coordinator, the autonomy you can give your teachers to modify your plan for advisory to meet their students' needs can really be beneficial. I have a great story about this. It comes from my wife. My wife is a 6th grade teacher, and her school implemented an advisory program. And their program, then advisory coordinator that was really dedicated and was pushing out a lot of things to the teachers to do, and they tended to be in that sort of challenge category. There were a lot of challenge building blocks, fun games, and things like that. Well, her particular mix of students were way too cool and mature and adult to be playing games. They had no interest in it. They didn't want to do it. And my wife got a lot of pushback from those. She was not building relationships with her students. It was a lot of real hard work just to get them to do what they were supposed to do. Gosh darn it. But my wife decided to take things in a different direction. She was at the time, and still is, married to someone who was working on an advisory program for middle schools. And so she took the stuff that I was working on around class discussions and tried it out with her students, and found that her students responded to this much better. The chance to sit around and have, kind of deep conversations about things that they don't normally get to have conversations about in school, at least in a way that's kind of sanctioned and have an adult listening to them and taking them seriously. They loved it. They ate it up. And from that point on, her advisory ran a lot better. So being able to give teachers the ability to pivot like that is really useful. But how do you do this? One is you can provide a lot of different options. So that puts a lot of the onus on whoever's coordinating the program to just put a lot of stuff together. Because every time you give an option, you're doubling the amount of work. So if you want to give teachers 3 options, that's triple the amount of work. You can allow teachers the freedom to modify content. That's I think important. But don't count on all teachers doing that, because that takes time. Not all teachers have that time. So you may end up with teachers that just do what's given to them, whether it works or not, and then you're going to get that really uneven experience where some students are enjoying advisory and some students are not, and then the students that are not talk about it to the students that are, and it can make it difficult to build that kind of school-wide culture of advisory. Another way you can do it is you can identify specific groups of students at the building level to receive targeted materials, essentially do RTI and advisory. This is actually what the school I taught at did. And while I was teaching kind of a general advisory and we didn't have a lot of planning or support, I don't remember it as a great experience. We had advisories that were set aside for students that needed special support, and it worked really well for them. They got what they needed. They had a goal and mission in their advisories, and also for some of those students, it meant they didn't have to take a support class. They got the support they needed in advisory, and then they got to take an elective. They got to take something fun for that class, that they would have otherwise been in a support class for. We try to kind of really help with this a lot. So I'm gonna do my sales pitch for Second Step right here. Is that one of the things that we've tried to do with the Second Step advisory program is to provide a lot of building blocks that are available, but to make it really easy to kind of sort through those building blocks, so that you as a coordinator or administrator can give us suggestions to your teachers for what to do. But it's very, very easy for a teacher to decide they need something else and to find that something else that they need from the different activities that we have available, so that they doesn't take a lot of effort for them to modify what's going on in their classroom. And then what is the result of this? This is the thing I think we really need to keep in mind. We're talking about how all these things you got to do to launch it and keep it going and getting buy-in. In the end, advisories can be super powerful. They strengthen student-teacher relationships. They improve academic outcomes and attendance. They lower discipline rates. This is all stuff that research shows they do. And and this has also been coming from research and from what I've seen in the field, the longer the program is in place, the easier and easier it is to maintain. It's really inspiring to hear from people who have long established advisory programs. And if you can find people that have, if you know people or you go to a conference where people are presenting on their programs and you can hear kind of what they're able to do, the effects that they have are really cool. And the fact that it gets easier becomes really clear. There's one school out here near Seattle that I originally knew about it because I student taught there way back when. It's had an advisory program in place for over 30 years. And at this point, it sustains itself. It's so ingrained in the culture of the school, and they have such a wealth of building blocks and experience, both amongst the students and the staff, that it would be harder for them not to do advisory than it would be to do advisory. So, it takes 30 years, it may take 20, 30 years to get there, but it can get there, and it'll probably take a lot less than that. And because you are all here in this webinar right now, and you're taking the materials we're providing home, and you're going to think about this, and you're going to prep for success, you're on the road to that already. You're a step ahead of a lot of people as they start their advisory program. So thank you very much for attending. I really appreciate it. The last slide that I'm going to talk about here is just some citations. And I'm talking about research. It's a real thing, and here's some stuff to look at. I also encourage you to look at non-research stuff. If nothing else, go to the AMLE website and do a search for articles on advisory, because there's some really good advisory articles. There's also an article written by me, but there's also some really good articles that have been written on advisory over the years, and they're worth a read. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Kate, and then we'll do some questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt. So we're going to do questions in about 2 minutes. I'm just going to give you a little bit about our current middle school program. So we just want to leave you with some information about our Second Step middle school program. And then obviously, middle school is an incredible time of learning, exploration, risk, lots of stuff going on for those kids. But how do we make them better people? That question is at the heart of our Second Step middle school program, which is a comprehensive social emotional curriculum that supports the whole child, but it's also your comprehensive advisory curriculum too. There are over 200 advisory activities from all of those building blocks that Matt was talking about earlier. So it is a fully digital curriculum. We highly recommend that you reach out to us to do a free trial so you can see the program in its entirety, even try it with some of the kids. It has a lot of current research intertwined into it in brain development and social psychology, et cetera, et cetera. So please check it out. We would love for you to call us. Again, free trial, sample lessons, lots of information online. Give us a call. And I'm going to open it up to questions for the last few minutes of the webinar. So I'm going to monitor these questions as you go through. So if you have a question, please write it in the questions box, and I will answer it, or we will answer it.
Well, Kate, there were some questions that came in earlier, and maybe you can address those. Is how do you assess whether or not an advisory program is working?
That's a good question. I think when you read, one of the things that I think I remember one of the researchers that did a lot of research on this, lamenting that it's very difficult sometimes. What often you do is you pick you pick indicators that show that your advisory program is having the effects that you're looking for. I think a really common one is attendance. A lot of schools do advisory programs. The idea is that it's going to get students more engaged in school, and they're going to show up more. So that's one way you can do it. It's a little more fuzzy wuzzy, but you can do climate surveys and things like that to look at how you're affecting the school climate and how students are feeling. And then, depending on what you're aiming to do, you should be able to see results. If you're really focused on academics, for example, you should hope to see an improvement in academics. If you're giving students a chance to do more study time, or do that sort of like academic check-in and check-out, you should see improvements. And you should particularly see improvements in those places around students kind of on the borders. What advisory is really good at doing is kind of tipping the scales in students' favor. Students that are straddling the line between success and failure.
All right, so there's another one right here that says, as we start our advisory program, what do we share with parents? Is there information we can share with parents? Thanks, Vicki.
I think it's a good question, and I think that, and I'm not going to answer it based on anything more than my own gut. And I think that the thing that would be really important to share with parents is why you're doing it, and why is this different from an academic class. That's an important thing to share with students too, and hopefully is really clear to staff, is that this is about relationships, and this is why we're doing it. Because when people, parents, students, staff, think of school as a place where you come to learn academics, taking this time to do something that's not learning about academics can seem like a waste of time. And really making that clear, I think, is important to get buy-in. And getting parent buy-in is really important, because especially if they see it as a waste of time and they want their students to be in academic classes longer.
All right. How can you help get a resistant staff member on board?
I really like the thing that the way that Doris framed it, that I tried to capture, is to listen to them, and to really take into consideration their concerns. Their concerns are valid. They may be coming from experience, and they can help inform what you want to do. But to really approach it from a solution-oriented way. As they express their concerns, think about how can we address your concerns? What's the solution to your concerns that is not don't do it? Another thing that I've seen talked about effectively is not to do advisory. Don't do everything all at once. So give yourself a couple of years to get started. Maybe take a whole year where you're setting aside a certain amount of time over the course of the year to plan and to involve your staff in that. And so that year two is when students see it. If you're reinvigorating an advisory program, don't necessarily reinvigorate the whole program at once. Start as a pilot. Take some teachers that are really committed, and let them run with this new version of advisory while you continue with whatever you're doing with the rest of your staff. And then those teachers can become evangelists. Well, they can also be guinea pigs to sort out problems and find those. You've got your teachers that are most committed finding the problems, which is what you want. They can sort those things out and then act as evangelists to the rest of the teachers. And so you roll it out in stages. Those are two strategies that I think are effective, or have heard of being effective.
That's awesome. And I think you kind of answered this question as you went through the webinar, but is a half hour twice a week enough?
Yes, absolutely.
We have trouble pulling away instructional time from teachers, so this is the time frame we're working with.
Yep. Half hour twice a week is actually quite generous, I think, because you can actually do a lot in a half an hour. You can do a lot more. You have a lot more options for what to do in half an hour than you have in schools that have 10 minutes. So that opens up things. You can use the challenge building blocks, you can use the discussion building blocks, but you can also do lesson building blocks and project building blocks in those half an hours. And I guess actually, as I think about it, I think that for you in particular, you actually have quite a bit of time. You can don't think of yourself as being time deficient for your advisory. Consider yourself lucky, because you can do a lot with 2 half-hour blocks a week. For those of you that are listening that do have like 10, 15 minutes a day or something like that, yes, you can do step 2. You know, doing one fun challenge activity, having one discussion, doing one check-in and check-out, doing a check-in and then a check-out in a week. Those are all important and effective things. You know, if you've only got 10 minutes a day, you're not going to move mountains, but you are gonna move the needle on relationships and student connection to school. It's not wasted time.
Matt, how do you feel about mixed grade advisories?
I think I have seen them work well. I have not seen or encountered one that launched well. So the idea behind a mixed grade advisory, I think the ideal of a mixed grade advisory is that you're giving younger students a chance to meet and interact with older students and kind of learn from them. You're putting older students in a position where they get to be mentors. And on paper, that's really powerful, especially that idea of older students getting to be mentors to younger students. That can do a lot to influence those older students to act in more pro-social ways. So on paper, it's really powerful. When I've talked to people who've done this, my wife's school did it. What happens at launch is that the older students want nothing to do with the younger students. They're really resistant to being, 8th graders are really resistant to being in a class with 6th graders. They act out and push back. Those 6th graders see the 8th graders acting out and pushing back, and they go, I want to be just like those 8th graders, so they act out and push back too, and it can become a real difficult thing. I've thought about this a lot because it's a question we get a lot. And as much as I've settled on anything, what my feeling is that a mixed grade advisory is kind of like your advanced advisory. If you start out with a same grade advisory, you can build that culture of advisory, and then move to a place where you have mixed grade advisories later on, when those 8th graders will be less resistant. You won't be fighting the battle of doing advisory along with the battle of doing advisory with 6th graders. You can do one battle at a time. I shouldn't phrase it as a battle because it's a very positive thing. You're conquering. No, that's not. You are climbing each mountain individually. You're not climbing both mountains at once.
And
you're not carrying a boulder. Never carry a boulder.
Never. And the final question, I think, unless you have some more, please enter them, is how does one go about getting the free trial? So I'll answer that question, and there's a couple of links that we're on, and Will, I'm not sure whether our screen is still being shared, but if you go to our website, just go to secondstep.org. If it's not on the screen anymore, oh, he's having me show my screen, so I'm going to show this one more time to you. The secondstep.org/middle school or /middle school. Check that out. You can also just call us if you want. That phone number is right there for you, but there's a ton of information on our website at secondstep.org. Check it out, and you can definitely sign up for that 15-day free trial, which gives you full access to the entire curriculum, advisory, social emotional learning, principal toolkit, and all of the professional development tools as well. So again, I just really want to thank you for being a part of this, and let us know if we can help you in terms of creating an advisory curriculum, advisory program, and a social emotional learning curriculum in terms of Second Step. And thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again, Matt and Kate, and thanks to all of you on the webinar today also. Please sign up for all of our AMLE webinars, which are free to all of our members. We absolutely love you all, and that's why we bring you the best. So check back at amle.org to get the next great webinar schedule. And also you heard from Kate and Matt about the resources on advisor on the AMLE website. If you go to the pull-down menu at amle.org, there's a topic for advisory, and you can get all those articles and research articles related to advisory is there for you. Again, great resources and ideas and more of us to help you reach every student, grow professionally, and create great schools. Thanks to Matt and Kate for your time and effort this afternoon, and the Committee for Children for sponsoring this webinar. And much appreciation to everyone out there who joined us today on the live webinar. And as mentioned earlier, the entire webinar will be archived on the AMLE website next week. So check that out again to revisit something or share with someone else who needs this information or needs another webinar. Again, keep on raising the praise for middle level education and AMLE. We're here to help you reach every student, grow professionally, and create great schools. Thank you very much.